yesterday and going forward here. So, disturbance is going to be the nature. This is a big call out, by the way. We're going to be talking about something that's one of the central pillars of this class. So the first central pillar that we've talked about is really, well, the Earth systems are, they vary across space and time, and they're highly interconnected. Disturbance is going to be another one that props up a lot of stuff. So today's lecture, the good thing is you'll have the opportunity to have this material reinforced upon you no fewer than maybe 20 more times before we walk out of this class at the end of the year. But here's what we're going to do today. It's a lot of textbook definition kind of stuff. We're going to understand the difference between resistance and resilience in the ecosystem. We're going to look at this thing called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which is a big operating theory for the advancement of ecology and productivity in the ecosystem. And then we're going to see these two examples of succession, which is how quickly do things come back, primary and secondary. And then the last thing is we're going to describe factors that determine species richness in a community. We know from about 10,000 feet what that looks like, but we haven't talked about what it looks like due to change in the environment. So with that, let's start here. So again, this is one of the big central pillars of our class, and I underlined the key stuff that we're really going to focus on today, which disturbance is a stand-in for this thing, changes in the environment. So the third statement is, organisms can respond to changes in the environment. So we need to understand what changes in the environment look like, have a firm understanding how to characterize change in the environment, because this whole secondary piece of the statement is survivability is dictated by all of these biological things that we're yet to study, and the frequency and severity of disruption. So we're going to pair the second part of the statement, but we're really going to focus most of our work with this underlined part of the statement. Does this make sense? All right, Cal, since you're here, you're up front. I need you to do me a favor. Come up here. I'm just going to have you read this. We're going to do a little demonstration. Josh, how do you feel?
I feel great.
Me too. Me too. Josh, here's what I need you to do. I'm going to give you my watch.
Oh, no.
And all I want you to do is time. Cal is, he's a fantastic thespian. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to see the guy. I just need you to read this, that first paragraph, just in a natural way.
First paragraph.
Yeah, and Josh is going to time how long it takes for you to do it.
I got it.
All right?
All right. Ready?
Yep.
The question of how many different species exist in a particular environment is central to the understanding of why it is important to promote and preserve species diversity. A uniform population of a single species of plants adapted to a particular environment is more at risk if environment changes occur. A more diverse population consisting of many species of plants has a better chance of including individuals that might be able to adapt to changes in the environment. Scientists use a formula called the biodiversity index to describe the amount of species diversity in a given area.
Stop. You recognize that? That was the introduction for our lab. Perfect. Josh, what's the time?
36 seconds.
Oh, very well done.
I agree.
36.
For you also.
So, we're going to do it again. We're going to do it again.
Are there going to be
change? So this time, I just need you to read it, and it's sometimes easier to read faster the second time.
Okay.
So resist the change there, and just try to go with the same pace.
Try to go the same pace?
Same pace.
Okay.
Ready?
Ready? The question of how many different species exist in a particular is central to
Yeah, keep reading. Keep reading. You got it. You got it. You can do it. You can do it. I believe in you.
Important to promote and preserve species diversity.
Just keep going. You got it. You got it.
A uniform population of what is that? A uniform population of a single species of plants adapted to a particular environment is more at risk of environmental changes. A more diverse population consisting of many species of plants has a better chance of including individuals that might be able to adapt to changes in the environment. Scientists use a formula called biodiversity index to describe the amount of species diversity in a given area. There we go.
Got it.
A minute 8. Beautiful. Okay, a minute 8.
I'm going to write that as 68 seconds. All right.
I think the point is like,
Get a little bit of composure, will you? My God. Jeez. Too
What kind of
disruptive.
plant is that?
What?
I can't tell you because it's part of an art project. But you'll know in the future. Wait, you're not done. One more time. We got to do one more attempt here. Same kind of thing. Try to repeat it was water, by the way. Try to repeat it in the same kind of tempo as you did the first time.
Okay. The question of how many different species exist in a particular environment is central to the understanding of why it is important to promote and preserve species diversity. A uniform population of a single species of plant. Single species of plant adapted to a particular environment is more at risk if environmental changes occur. A more diverse population consisting of many species of plant has a better chance of including individuals that might be able to adapt to changes in the environment. Scientists use a formula called the biodiversity index to describe the amount of species diversity in a given area.
42.
You really sped up there. That's all right. You got it. Give Cal a round of applause. Right?
That was
a lot. That was a lot. I thought it would be easier for him to keep going, you know, but very disruptive stuff. Stay with me. The analogy is going to be a little cheeky, but it also is important because I want to draw out some stuff that's really key for us to know, and it's the kind of misconception that kids get caught up on a lot. So changes in the environment, we call that disruption. Cal, how'd you feel? Fairly disrupted?
Disrupted, yeah.
Disrupted is what we were going for. So ecosystems are affected differently by disturbance, and then how well they bounce back after a disturbance occurs is a big piece of it. So here's our classroom kind of textbook definition for disturbance, and what I want you to have in your mind is an understanding that this can be all kinds of stuff. Disturbance is in an event, a single event that's caused chemical, physical, biological agents, whatever, and it results in changes in population size. So this is where the complexity of diversity on our planet kind of comes together. So we have individuals make populations, interactions between different populations of species makes communities, and communities make ecosystems. So we have an ecosystem, and disruption occurs, and it causes changes in the population sizes or the interactions between species, and therefore we have change in the ecosystem. So this disturbance we're really focused on, it can be any kind of thing, and it's going to cause alterations to population size or changes in how species interact with one another. This is the piece of where the analogy comes in. There are two terms that are definitely not interchangeable in this context. The first one is resistance. So this is a measurement of how a disturbance can affect the flow of energy and matter in an ecosystem. So we have an ecosystem, and then we're going to measure the effect that the disturbance has on the ability for that ecosystem to be productive. So stay with me on the analogy. Production in this case is Cal reading the statement. We knew that under normal circumstances, he can read the statement in 36 seconds. In an ecosystem, we would measure that as the amount of productivity and exchange of matter and energy, which we can quantify all of that. The second piece is a measure of how the disturbance affects that. So in the second, I'm disturbing Cal and I'm doing all kinds of weird things, and he's trying to perceive. There was one drop of the paper which kind of messes up the analogy. I was too disruptive in the first time, but I was trying to just be annoying, but I wasn't trying to do anything to the piece of paper. So we had this, and he was resisting the disruption, and it was really hard. His resistance is low. His resistance is really low. But look, it increased the amount of time, so the productivity or the efficiency of productivity is affected. So in this second example, in this second reading, we are looking at how resistance occurs. So it's disrupted the flow of matter and energy, but it hasn't actually changed the composition. What he was doing was still the same. The second was a little bit different. So the second time I was trying to take the paper and throw it on the ground. And then he had to go back and try to figure it out. And some of the times it was like, oh my gosh, where am I? And you could maybe go back to the beginning of the statement and just be like, I lost my place, I got to start again, or I have to go back a little bit, or it takes me some time. This is the resiliency example. So how much time is lost, in this case his resiliency was a little higher than his resistancy, it still affected the time, the efficiency of productivity, that we had to resume our place. And really when we look at this, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about resiliency, but we'll also ask you to do things about describing resistance. And if you say things that are correct, but you have this opposite, I can't give you credit for that. They're not interchangeable terms. Yeah, Joe.
In the definition for resilience, when it says it returns to its original state, does that mean it has to be exactly the same after as it was before?
Mm-hmm. So how long, that's a really good call out. How long does it take for it to look the way that it looked before? How long did it take to get to the place where it looked before? Okay? These are going to come up again a lot. So this key idea that I want to layer on top of this is this principle, that it's not a principle actually, it's a theory. And the reason it's a theory is because we can duplicate it experimentally and we can measure how it looks in the ecosystem, but it does look different across all ecosystems, but there are some things that are common trends that are shared. So we already know higher biodiversity is better. And so when we're looking at the health of an ecosystem, we're usually going to say, well, it's this healthy based on what the biodiversity index tells us it is. And so higher is good. And what we find is the highest species biodiversity is found when there's an intermediate level of disturbance. So by this I mean if there's a very rare level of disturbance, the species that compete the best, according to the competitive exclusion principle, those are the ones that are going to dominate. So you put two species together, one is a little bit better in the environment, they take off, they eventually displace the other species. So rare disturbances favor these ones that compete the best. If we have super frequent disturbance, it's too much. It eliminates almost all the species, and you're looking at an ecosystem that no longer resembles the original because it's just been disturbed too greatly or too often. It just keeps getting hammered and going back a few stages. But when the level of disturbance is somewhere in the middle, amazingly, this is where we actually find. I put together a couple call-outs from this version in the textbook, which I don't know why they chose this example. I feel like it's really poor example, but nonetheless, let me break it down for you. So this is showing what the intermediate disturbance hypothesis tells us. The species richness is the highest when you have an intermediate level, and here's their example. They're measuring snail density, so number of snails, and then they're looking at species richness of algae. And so what they find is the snails are the disturbance. So when you put the snails, it disturbs the algae community, right? And so when there are a few snails present, there's a low diversity because the best algae outcompete. But when the disturbance goes in, when it becomes more severe, the species richness actually goes up because there's all sorts of snails consuming different algae, and the level goes up. But if you get too many snails, the disruption is too high, and it's too severe, and it's degrading all the species of algae. So let's look at the model. This is the model that you should have in your mind, and this model the trends apply to all ecosystems, although it doesn't always look exactly like this. So the solid line refers to species richness, which is on this scale on the left value axis. On the right value axis is the dotted line for species richness. So we know that biodiversity index is going to give us the highest when both of those are high. And then magnitude of disturbance is what we're changing on the category axis. So here you can see when there's no disturbance, you only maybe have a few species, the ones that are the best. And as you add a little more disturbance, the species richness goes way up. But there's still, the best ones are out competing, so you might have a lot of species, but most of them are all the same species. As disturbance continues, the evenness in the distribution of species goes up, and so you get this point of intersection that would exist, and it looks a little differently for every ecosystem, but you find that at an intermediate level of disturbance, that's when it's the best. When this disturbance is too high, you'll notice the evenness is really high because every species is approaching 0 as it gets closer and goes down. So this model is what we have to think about. There was a really good question in the last class, which I've shown this for a few years of teaching this, and no one's ever noticed before, but it was a great question, so I'm gonna address it for you guys as well for your benefit. The question was, well, what about the scale? How do you know where this, like if you change the scale for either one of these, this intersection point is in a different spot, right? So if you changed and blew this up, then these would intersect at somewhere else. So how do you know what level of disturbance is the right level? And the answer is, this is derived, the scales are derived based on the biodiversity index. So they first start and find where the most biodiverse is, and then set the scale based on that intersection point. And so they plot the lines first and then make the scale, which is kind of a cool mathematical approach. Kind of a cool thing. Does that make sense? But the main takeaway is intermediate disturbance creates the highest biodiversity in the ecosystem. I have a little case study here. And I was going to pull together, I couldn't really find good aerial images. I was going to show the Australian fire right now. I don't know if you've heard about this, but there was the military had sparked a fire and a wildfire in Australia. It's extremely damaging. But I couldn't find good aerial photos. But I did have, this is from last year, the Camp Fire in California, which is maybe an example we might be a little more familiar with. It's also been in the news. That was caused by the electrical company in California, and it caused a lot of change. So these questions, by the way, look really simple, but they're not. So we're going to watch a little bit of this film, which has no narration, and it's just a quiet film. And I was going to play my song, but I played it at the beginning anyways. Great disturbance theme song. It's a must add to your musical playlist. But let me play this, and we'll think about the resistance and the resilience, and then identify physical changes, and then look at the impact on the forest ecosystem. Drones are unbelievable, man. This whole thing was taken with drones. Everyone had been evacuated from this area. This is typically a forest ecosystem. The video has a bit of a bias towards the human populations because the tragedy is mostly linked to people lost their homes, and there was a lot of property and economical damage, but the ecosystem was damaged as well. Let's talk about number one as this continues to play in the background. Rate the resistance and the resilience of the ecosystem. Let's start with resistance. What do you think?
It seems like pretty low. I mean, considering...
Give me some evidence. What do you see observationally that tells you that it's low?
Well, considering that it's a forest ecosystem, I'm seeing a very small amount of actual physical trees.
Mm-hmm. What else? Let's stay with resistance for a second. What else do we see? What else about the resistance? Yeah.
Well, a forest ecosystem is really reliant on trees and other plant life, which is damaged very easily by fire, which affects the ability to produce energy. So it's very unproductive. If a forest has no trees, it can't be productive.
So if we think about that definition, which I really like, it's how does this affect the flow of matter and energy? So because we've not only affected the primary production by taking out one of the key primary producers, as Fiona noted, we've really changed the composition of the habitat. So if we have a complex network of niches of species living in different areas, well, in a very three-dimensional way, this ecosystem no longer resembles what we would expect. So the resistance of the ecosystem for this specific disturbance is somewhat low. Let's talk about resilience. What about resiliency? What do you think? Pace of change, how does it do to get back to where it was? Will?
Well, I think the video isn't super necessarily descriptive of this because it's reasonably recent after it happened, but we know that it takes a long time for trees to grow.
It takes a long time for
So
trees to grow.
We can say that the resilience isn't gonna be that high since it.
So part of our answer is don't know, don't have enough information. Spencer?
I mean, in this shot right now, there are like some trees that are, or shot before this, some trees that were like fine.
Mm-hmm.
It looked fine, but
There are a few trees
Yeah.
that are fine.
I would say that the resilience is actually like decently high because the trees do grow back. Like it's
We
not,
assume,
it's not.
yeah.
I mean, usually, traditionally,
Right,
trees
yep.
will grow back.
Yep.
And like Spencer was saying, there's still some trees there which are able to spread their seeds or whatever, and then there more trees can grow. So it might change it might reduce the biodiversity of the area,
Mm-hmm.
but there will still be trees there, most likely.
Joe, were you going to say anything else?
I was going to say what Will said about trees taking a long time.
Trees
to grow
taking
back.
a long time to grow. So a couple things to keep in your mind around when we're looking at the resistancy and the resiliency. The first thing is that the resistance is definitely contingent on what is the severity of the disturbance. So it might be pretty high, but it's just not high enough to withstand this. This was a fairly severe event. And so it makes it look like the ecosystem is low, but whenever we're talking about resistancy, we definitely need to consider, well, what is the severity? It's contingent on the severity of the disruption. The resiliency, you definitely hit on the key thing, and the big part is ecosystems in all of their complexity and old growth forests and things like that, they take a long time. So one of the parts that makes this science so difficult is, as an ecologist, you can't go out and lay down your yardstick and just measure it because the scope of observation may exceed your lifetime. So you can do some approximations and some models and things like that, but in this case, these trees won't grow back really very quickly. There's a great case study. I lived and worked in Yellowstone in 2006, and there were all kinds of guests, even at that time, that would come and they felt so sad about the fire that occurred in 1993, which was very devastating to the area. It took out a lot of the lodgepole pines. And they would look at these trees, and they're little saplings, and there's lots of just dead standing trees. I don't know if you've ever been out there. And they go, oh my gosh, such a beautiful area, so sad. But the lodgepole pines actually require fire for the pine cones to open up and for seeds to be dispersed. So their resiliency is actually contingent on disruption in that case. And the ecosystem will return, but people, they just look at trees and they say they're dead. It's so sad, and it's not sad, but you have to have the right kind of scope, and you have to think about things in the right frame. And the reason I really want to mention this is because when we look at all the changes that are happening on the planet in the future part of our class, this will come up many more times about, well, Earth, and we're changing Earth, and all of these changes to Earth, and how much can the Earth sustain? Well, the Earth is insanely resilient. It's not the Earth that's at risk, it's our own species. So let's talk about the physical and chemical characteristics that occur in the forest ecosystem when the mature trees die. What do you see? What are the physical ones we kind of talked about when Fiona talked about habitat change? What are some others, though? Yeah.
There's probably a general lack of producers considering they're sort of out of the habitat.
Yeah.
So that probably destroys like the bedrock of that ecosystem.
At least the primary productivity in the short term, for sure, yeah.
And if you're looking at the atmosphere as well, you can just see how like thick it is from all the smoke.
Yeah.
I'm sure that
So we
definitely
block out some of the light, we change
Yeah.
the chemical composition, especially in the short term again. Any positive changes?
I guess potentially clear some of the land, like if there were some disease or something from the
Yeah.
species, if that was
Exactly,
going away.
yeah, clears out. That happens a lot, and sometimes there are controlled burns for that purpose to help remove pathogens. That's a great example, yeah.
Also, doesn't it clear out a bunch of the dead plants that
Clears
might-
out a lot of the dead. Puts one certain thing that we've talked about into a hyperdrive. What do we know? There's one key thing. We took all this matter and then we condensed it and put it down on the soil. What does that sound like? Decomposition. We put in all the biogeochemical cycles are in hyperdrive. So we've broken down. It doesn't take a long time for decay and all that because the fire did the job for us. So there's actually some positive benefits, and that just shows part of what's driving the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Last one for number one, describe the changes for the impact of the forest ecosystem. I think we've done a fairly good job to understand this, but there's a lot of changes. So these simple questions, they actually have complex answers, And what helps is thinking a little bit closer to exhaustion about examples like this. So, now we want to kind of turn the page and talk about this process. Whenever we're thinking about resiliency, the process of how quickly the ecosystem returns back to normal, that's called succession. And so the key definition for succession generally is, it's the replacement of species over time, and it occurs in a fairly predictable manner and a fairly predictable timeline because of some factors that we'll show. I put this quote in here that relates to what I was just talking about. When I was in undergraduate, I worked at this place called the Roe Bird Sanctuary. It was in central Nebraska on the Platte River Basin, and it's one of the most important biological corridors for migratory birds of anywhere in the world. And there's this phenomena that occurs in late spring, or in early spring, March, April timeframe, where these sandhill cranes, millions of them, come and nest in this area and bed down in a spot that's about 20 miles square. And there are so many birds that in the morning when they take off and when they come at night, it blocks out the sun. They're big birds, but there's millions of them. It's incredible. And Jane Goodall, do you guys know who Jane Goodall is?
The ape woman.
Yeah,
the
the
ape
gorillas,
woman.
right?
She's a conservationalist, primologist. She studied intelligence in apes and was really one of these forward-thinking people who helped us understand animal behavior and animal intelligence. But she came to the Roe Bird Sanctuary, and I got to go to this question-answer session, and I had just taken a class that was similar to this on global change, and I was asking her, like, well, what's the deal? And I hadn't yet really learned about ecological succession at the time, and she gave me a really quick and memorable crash course on the fact that nature is incredibly resilient, and it's the proper use of the word. That even though there's a lot of change on the planet, nature has mechanisms to make this happen. So let's try to understand a little bit about these mechanisms and what they look like. So primary succession is going to be the process of the predictable replacement of species over time, like I just mentioned, when you go all the way back to soil. So these are extremely severe events of disruption. So much so that all of the species are knocked back and all you're left with is bare rock, bare soil. So let's make a quick list. What kinds of disruption would that look like? So here's primary. What are some examples that would be so severe?
Earthquake, maybe?
Maybe only where the earthquake occurred. But yeah.
Human impact?
Potentially, give me an example, because there's some things that humans would do that would definitely cause just there to be bare rock, and then there's all kinds of stuff that would be.
Nuclear bomb.
There we go. That's a great
That would do
example.
it.
I was going to say fracking.
Also,
but
yeah, nuclear meltdowns. work
Yeah,
as well.
nuclear meltdowns, yeah. And we've had these things occur. We've had all of this occur. What else? What are some other things?
Mining, maybe?
Potentially mining.
I'm trying to think of bare rock, but
We've got an ecosystem, then something happens, and then you're like, wow, now we only have rock. What do you think? It is a Friday. Oh, there's a good one. Volcano. I love it. What else?
Like tsunami.
Tsunami potentially. I'm going to put super flood, because that could maybe, if we have these big waves and they bring a lot of salt water, which could really affect the species. On the same front, we could do like a super fire. So a fire that was much worse than this fire. We still see some, but there could be examples of fire that, depending on the environmental conditions, it could be really severe. All right? So the big idea here is that it's all the way back to soil, and there's a couple key things that I want to call out here. So if we look at this process, exposed rock here, this is time. So this is a forest ecosystem as an example, but we could use any type of ecosystem to talk about this. The first things that come in are these lichens and mosses, annual flowers, some small grasses, things that are easily wind dispersed, perennials. Then eventually we're moving in this direction until we get these species that are over here. In this case, these are all the species that have outcompeted everyone else. The highest biodiversity is probably somewhere in the middle here, right, because of the disturbance. So we have a couple key terms that layer in here. Primary species are the ones that colonize fairly rapidly. And the example on the text I actually think is really great. These lichens and mosses, if you took all the natural history of plants and wrote it into a book, there'd be 5 chapters. Lichens and mosses would be chapter 2. They've been around for many, many, many millions of years. So there are evolutionary processes and mechanisms in place for these species. They come back really quickly. These have been surviving disruption and change across planet Earth for a really long time. Ice ages, everything you can imagine, right? Volcanoes, meteor showers, everything. Lichens and mosses, they know how to get it done. After that, there's these grasses that grow, some small things. Biodiversity is probably highest in the middle. And then on the far end of the spectrum, all the way over here for these ones that are the ones that outcompete, we call those climax species. So at the apex version of the ecosystem at its most mature state, or its climax, these are case-selected species. These are the ones that remain basically unchanged if there's no disruption there. Huge trees, old trees, bears, elephants, those kinds of things. They remain there until there's a disruption. So what we've come to understand about this process is the main thing that over time a series of distinct communities develop, and it happens in certain stages, and we can kind of chart that out. Not everything always makes it to a forest because of some factors that we'll look at here in a second. So here is the next example, and luckily there's not a lot of things to know. It's just secondary and primary. So secondary it's the exact same process. You almost maybe thought, why are you giving us the same picture twice? But it is a different picture. And the key distinction between primary and secondary is the disruption could be pretty severe, but it's not severe that you go all the way back to rock. There are some species that remain intact, even though they might be widely dispersed, but they're still there. So secondary succession, the soil is present, but all plants may have been removed, but the early aliving plants set into a pathway of succession to occur again. So give me some examples of what we would imagine would cause secondary succession. What are some disturbance examples? I'll give you a hint. Some of the ones that I was like, probably not for primary.
Earthquake.
There we go. Earthquake.
Tsunami.
Just like a normal fire, sure. A normal flood.
Normal bomb.
Yeah, bombs can be pretty severe. I'm gonna put bombs over here. Bombs are pretty severe. Bombs. Cool. All right, so we've got some examples, and everybody feels like they understand the distinction. There's one thing that I need to call out here that's really important to keep in your mind, and students answer this wrong occasionally, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned it, is it doesn't go primary and then secondary. Whatever is the disturbance and the severity of the disturbance in the ecosystem, that is what causes succession to be kicked off. And so if it goes all the way to dirt, we're talking about primary successive processes. If it goes back to secondary, it's secondary successive processes. And the reason it doesn't go primary to secondary is because the rate of change in the ecosystem is different dependent on the event. So even though they both have a stage where it's annual wildflowers, this is more rapid if the disruption is secondary than if the disruption is primary. Does it make sense? So it's not one and then the other, it's either one or the other. Okay? Excellent. We get out at 50?
Yeah.
We got a rock, man. I'm like talking slow today, I guess. So a couple of the factors that really matter. So all the things that we've talked about before, latitude, climatological factors, environments that are already kind of harsh are the most vulnerable, deserts, tundra, etc. There are already species living on the edge because there's not a lot of resources in these places. So you add stress into the environment like disruption, it becomes even worse. So nothing new there, it's basically what you would assume. The other big one is the scale of time. So the longer time, the more ecological processes can occur. I mentioned a couple things here that we don't know a lot about yet, but we'll know a lot more about in about a week. but the rate of new species being created, which is driven by evolutionary processes, that can cause a big effect on how quickly speciation can occur. The next one is habitat size. Habitats that are larger are usually, they have more opportunities, there are more niches, there's more ways that succession can occur, so there's a greater potential for species. Those always happen faster. So when the habitats are smaller or when the habitats are fragmented, which we'll talk about later, those species are a little bit, or those processes are a little bit slower. The last one here is distance away from other communities. So those lichens, mosses, small grasses, those seeds, all those organisms have to come from somewhere. They usually come from other places. And so the proximal effects of how close is this environment to other habitats, that really matters. Everybody all right? I want to do this case study even though we're short. We'll have just enough time to finish it. Yeah, we'll have just enough time. We're going to look at this Mount St. Helens, which is, this has been a really remarkable thing. It's occurred all in the duration of my lifetime, so I've been able to see a lot of change that they talk about in this film.
Mount St. Helens in Washington State is one of the most well-monitored volcanoes on the planet, and with good reason. It is still active. And more than 3 decades to the day after it launched a stunning and destructive display of lava and ash, it continues to transform a region, and it...
Oh no, what did I do? Oh, this is why I shouldn't have done anything. I'm such an idiot. Hold on. We're going to get it.
Mount St. Helens in Washington State is one of the most well-monitored volcanoes on the planet, and with good reason. It is still active. And more than 3 decades to the day after it launched a stunning and destructive display of lava and ash, it continues to transform a region and its ecology. Even now, scientists are still learning about the aftermath and how sunlight is emerging from the ashes. Science correspondent Miles O'Brien has the story, part of our new weekly series about exploring the leading edge of science.
36 years after its spectacular, deadly eruption, Mount St. Helens still rumbles and bears scars from that first shabby day. But hike down the slopes, away from the jagged crater just a little, and you'll see Mother Nature hard at work. And there's a good chance you'll bump into a team of scientists led by John Bishop. He is an evolutionary biologist at Washington State University, Vancouver.
The goal of our research is to understand how plant and animal communities reform after catastrophic disturbance.
Bishop is one of a select group of researchers studying this rebound from a volcanic eruption. Back in 1980, Mount St. Helens had given scientists all kinds of clues that a big disturbance was brewing. 2 months before it blew, the volcano was venting huge amounts of steam, and there was a series of earthquakes. Even with all those ominous signs, the eruption was larger than anyone predicted. It happened at 8:32 on the morning of May 18, 1980. An earthquake caused the north face of the mountain to collapse.
After that, it uncorked an explosion that was directed horizontally and leveled the forest 13 miles out from the volcano.
The eruption column of volcanic ash and gas rose 80,000 feet, while a tsunami of 1,800-degree gas and rock raced down the valley at 450 miles an hour, a so-called pyroclastic flow.
Anything biological that was remaining after the landslide would have been completely vaporized. It was just a barren landscape, gray and pumice-colored.
It killed every living thing in a 230-square-mile area. What was left was akin to a moonscape. 57 people died. Some remains were never recovered. Bishop and his team had a front-row seat as nature got busy bringing this place back to life. They wanted to know where it begins and how it takes root. Here, it started with these purple flowers. Alpine lupin were the first plants to return. For many years, they were pretty much the only game in town. As they went through their life cycles over several seasons, they created soil from the volcanic ash. That made it possible for woody plants, like the Sitka willow, to find a home. They are how a forest gets started. It hasn't been easy for them.
One of the things we've realized about these willows is that they're not getting big. That's important because they create habitat for birds and mammals. We've learned that these landscapes are characterized by extreme instability in the populations of the plants and animals that colonize them.
In a recovering ecosystem like this one, where just a few species have managed to regain a toehold, even seemingly insignificant pests can play an outsized role in how the landscape bounces back. These weevils are an invasive species with a particular taste for the Sitka willow.
Any stem larger than about 1 centimeter is usually destroyed by this weevil. And the effect of it is to keep these plants small, not let them form the architecture that's needed for bird and mammal habitat.
But Bishop says it's important to remember we're still early on in what will be a very long game. He says the plants and insects will battle it out over time, and eventually the ecosystem will become more diverse, more stable, and this will be a forest again.
When I'm out there working on this plane, one moment...
Let me pause it here, and I want to touch on a couple things in our last minute and a half together. Let's look at, well, first, what kind of succession occurs? Primary for sure, right? Everything was vaporized. Let's talk about the rate of severity. And this kind of stuff, I want to try to see some improvement in our language when we do this. What does rate sound like?
Like a fraction.
A fraction or some type of comparison,
Like 0
right?
to 1,
So if you just say something like, well, this is severe, it's catastrophic, compared to what? If you give me something where you say, well, it's the severity from it's not very severe and no species biodiversity to all species biodiversity was lost, this is really severe, this is really catastrophic, suddenly that answer has a lot more meaning to it and the language is kind of curated. What about number 2 really quick? The impact on biodiversity. Yeah.
Well, completely destroyed biodiversity. There is
Completely
nothing
destroyed in the short term,
Mhm.
but in the long term, potentially a good thing because we had an old growth forest there. So they talk about some pioneer species. Did you catch any?
the plants.
The alpine
The-
lupin,
yeah.
and they showed examples of small birds and mammals that are coming back. Those are all pioneer species. They didn't give you any climax species, but we know from some contextual clues what's these old growth forest climax trees that take a long time to grow, right? So pulling in observations and bringing it together and making sense of the case study. Great stuff. Don't forget that the biodiversity calculations are due at the end of the day. I'll be around for a minute after the end of school if you need a little help on that. But it's pretty discrete. Don't overthink it. It's a really simple example for claim evidence reasoning. Have a great day and a great weekend. We'll see you guys next